Hello and welcome to this HESES training video. In this video we'll start with a reminder of where data verification sits in the HESES timeline, and then we move on to consider the need for data verification and the role that it plays as part of our data assurance process. We'll look at the importance of the OFS portal before then moving on to data verification in the HESES workbook itself, validation errors and comparison tables being the two topics there. We'll also look at initial explanations, and then we'll discuss data verification queries before moving on to sign off. Finally, for anything which might change after this, we'll briefly touch on the data amendments process. We've already seen that the census date is either the 1st of November for further education and sixth form colleges and academies, or the 1st of December for everybody else, and likewise the submission deadline is noon on the appropriate date, either in the middle of November or December. And as before, please check our documentation for the exact dates each year. Data verification for each group of providers begins after the associated submission deadline, and it continues until the final sign-off deadline for all providers, which is in late January or early February, again depending on how the calendar falls. Let's zoom out for a moment to see where data verification fits in the bigger scheme of things. Naturally, we expect providers to follow best practice when compiling and submitting data, because this is used to determine funding as well as for other purposes. And for these reasons, it's important for us to use a robust data assurance process, and this starts with data verification, where we ask if the data supplied to us is fit for purpose. Other activities such as audits and/or data reconciliations may take place at a later date, but for now we're focusing on the data verification process. It's important to note that where a provider fails to submit data on time or returns data that is not credible after verification, we may allocate funds based on our own estimates of student activity. We reserve the right to use our own estimates of data where we have reason to believe provider data is not fit for purpose. We reserve the right to review funding allocations for the most recent 7-year period. So what are we looking for when it comes to HESES? Well, we want the best possible representation of your higher education provision. This allows us to make accurate grant allocations. Data verification allows us to be confident in the accuracy of your data, to be confident in the robustness of your data processes, allows us to identify any large or unexpected changes compared to previous years, and to understand the context of your data and how HESES relates to what's happening with your provision. Notice that it's common for us to ask queries of most or all providers. It's our first step in the due diligence process. As just mentioned, things like data reconciliation and audit may follow. It benefits us for all of these reasons, and hopefully it should give you an opportunity to think about your provision and how it's changing. Submitting the HESES workbook is done via the OFS portal. Why? Because it's a secure, controlled method of sending and receiving data returns. Please do not send HESES workbooks by email. Aside from the fact that email is not a wholly reliable medium, especially with attachments, its security is not good. If you find that you need to send us any additional information that could be sensitive, please contact us in advance and we will be able to arrange a secure method of transferring the information. You can access the portal at ofsproviderportal.officeforstudents.org.uk. For more on this, see our video on the OFS Provider Portal and HESES, www.officeforstudents.org.uk/how to submit your data returns, and www.officeforstudents.org.uk/how to manage your portal users. For help with all portal matters, please contact portal@officeforstudents.org.uk. Before we go on to look at the data verification process, let's focus on what gets checked in the workbook itself. This checking takes two forms: validation errors and checks in the comparison tables. Validation errors make the workbook invalid. These need to be corrected before submitting. Comparison table checks, if present, do not necessarily indicate that there's anything wrong, but it's just that the data verification team may well ask questions about them. This is the top part of the information tab in the workbook, and as we're passing by, I'll point out that it shows useful dates as a reminder. But the main thing to see here is that underneath these are workbook checks. You should check these before submitting your workbook. They summarize issues or potential issues with the data in the workbook. As just discussed, these are classified as validation checks, which make the workbook invalid, and comparison table checks, where there are significant differences. And these, of course, will inform data verification queries. Remember, validation errors occur where data is not feasible rather than just being unlikely. In this example, a negative number has been entered in a workbook cell that cannot be negative. As you can see here, this will be highlighted in red on the workbook itself above the appropriate column, and also to the side of the table in question where all the test criteria are shown. The presence of validation errors will also be flagged on the information tab that we were just talking about, and once they've been corrected, you should see the no validation errors message there, at which point the workbook can be submitted to the portal. The other checks in the workbook are comparison table checks, sometimes referred to as credibility checks, and you can see these on the tables to the right of the data entry tables in the HESES workbook. These are populated with data from the current year and previous returns as well. Significant changes will be flagged alongside each table. Now, as I've said before, this is not necessarily an error, it's just not necessarily what was expected, so the data verification team will almost certainly query them. We'll look at that process in a later slide. Here's an example which picks up on a change in a comparison in one of these tables, and you can see the conditions which are being tested to the side of this table. After finalizing your submission, you can, if you like, write to us to explain the reasons for the credibility checks before the data verification process begins. We refer to this as submitting initial explanations. Now, I should stress that this is not mandatory, but it can speed up the data verification process. There isn't any prescribed format, but if you want to take this opportunity, then please send these as soon as you can to dataVerification@officeforstudents.org.uk. As an example, a provider may have discontinued some postgraduate taught courses, substantially reducing the count of PGT years of engagement in comparison to last year. Here we can see this drop when judged against the criteria for this table alongside it. After the submission deadline, the workbook and any initial explanations will be used by our data verification team to assess whether the data is reasonable. Usually within 5 working days of the submission deadline, we email each provider and we send a letter with full instructions on the data verification process, a data verification queries or DVQ document listing specific queries that we have, and specifying a deadline for receiving your responses. Initially, this will be 5 working days away. As we get towards the end of the verification period, that horizon may shorten. A note again that querying data doesn't mean that the data is wrong, but it's just something about it which is unexpected. Providers may be asked to provide additional information or to correct data, and generally data verification is an iterative process which could have multiple rounds of queries. We base our queries on the data in the comparison tables and any other relevant issues or data that we are aware of. So now let's look at the actual method of doing all of this. First, let's focus on the data verification queries, the DVQs. You may hear it referred to as the DVQ template. It's a Microsoft Word document and it contains all the detail of the queries and provider responses. It's exchanged by email between the data verifier and the person that each provider has nominated as their student data contact throughout the verification process. We strongly recommend that each provider nominate more than one student data contact to avoid single points of dependence due to holidays or unscheduled absence. To do this, please write to HESES, HESES at officeforstudents.org.uk to nominate others in this role. Remember to get your portal administrator to set them up on the OFS portal. And as we said before, it's a good idea to save workbooks and correspondence where other team members can access them if required. These factors are particularly important because of the tight timetable for data verification. Now we'll look at an example of the format of the DVQs and how they are built up through the data verification process. This slide will give you an idea of the back and forward of the data verification process. Here's just one page from the Word document that I just described that's exchanged between the data verifier and the student data contact throughout the verification process. Here we see questions on comparison table E, which is about the proportions of new entrants. We won't show the comparison table itself here because we just want to show the format of the data verification queries. Under the heading Table Name / Topic, the relevant place on the data entry table in question is identified. In this case, it's the row for full-time and sandwich year-out home fee undergraduates. In the next column, we see the reason for the query, and then the data verifier's request for further details. Then to the right, we see the provider's response. Note that the queries are dated. Please date your own responses in the adjoining column for ease of reference. To further assist this, if there is more than one exchange of queries and responses, data verifiers will often color code the queries to help distinguish them one from another. And if this happens, it would be very helpful if you can do the same for your own corresponding responses, as you can see here. Finally, once a query has been successfully answered, the entire row will be shaded grey, and that shows that the query has been completed. In a moment, we'll talk about how to respond to DVQs, but first I'll mention the most frequent queries. These tend to focus on things like changes in the proportions of student numbers by price group, which of course are derived from subject groupings, by mode of study and fundability status. Essentially, we're asking how and why has your provision changed? In terms of responses to DVQs, we're looking for responses that directly relate to the query raised. But of course, if it's related to another query, you can also cross-reference your responses if that's appropriate. We're looking for responses that have an appropriate level of detail and that show an understanding of HESES definitions. Newcomers to the data verification process sometimes find it tricky to get into generating a response. Asking yourself the questions how and why has our provision changed are often good ways of finding this way in. A single underlying issue, as I said, may be the reason for more than one query, so do please feel free to cross-reference and link your responses accordingly. It may also be helpful to review your responses from previous years, as they may still apply. Before sending back your responses, please check that you have answered all of the queries that have been raised. It often happens that the data verification process highlights the need to make changes to your workbook, and if this is the case for you, in the first instance, please contact your data verifier who will assist you. We'll talk more about this on the next slide. Please email your responses to dataverification@officeforstudents.org.uk. Please respond within the deadline set when the DVQs were sent to you. Initially, this will be 5 working days, but as the data verification process continues, because several rounds of queries may be needed, and as the sign-off deadline approaches, tighter deadlines may be stipulated. As mentioned in our video about the OFS provider portal, those that have done HESES before may notice that the new portal now incorporates sign-off into portal processing. This is a change from past practice. Before HESES 25, sign-off was made using a separate document which had to be signed by the provider's accountable officer. From HESES 25 onwards, the new portal allows sign-off to be integrated into portal processing. This means that once all queries are resolved and any amendments have been processed, your HESES return is regarded as having been signed off. Signing off at this stage in the process indicates that the provider is satisfied with the submission. Very occasionally, we may revisit DVQs if further information comes to light in the data verification process, and this may result in additional queries being made. If, after all queries are resolved, you wish to amend your submission, please consult your data verification specialist before the final sign-off deadline. We expect that the data we use will be the final version submitted and signed off, but sometimes errors are identified in the data after it has been signed off, or even after the OFS has used the data. Signed off data can be amended, but we will only accept amendments to final submitted data in exceptional circumstances. To be accepted for amendment, errors must be widespread and significant, relate to clear evidence of data error rather than reinterpretation of the data, and be likely to have a material impact on one or more of our uses of the data. A data amendment panel will assess errors using information provided to them and then decide or recommend whether we require the errors to be corrected. If you believe that your data may need to be amended in this way after sign-off, please contact us straight away. For further details, please see our website at this address, www.officeforstudents.org.uk/data and analysis/amendments to data. And as usual, everything after the domain name there is hyphenated. We have a number of resources for providers, and we'll look at the main ones here, but we will also highlight additional resources as we go through this series of recordings. For a high-level view of OFS funding, see our Finance and Funding page, www.officeforstudents.org.uk/for-providers/finance and funding, with the last two parts of that URL having the words hyphenated. For an overview of recurrent funding specifically, add the hyphenated words recurrent funding to the last URL, or perhaps an easier way is to use the search function on our main web page and enter recurrent funding. For more detail about funding, see our annual guide to funding, and you can search for that term on our website to find the latest edition. The best place to start for HESES resources is the main HESES page on the OFS website, which can be found at www.officeforstudents.org.uk/HESES, and of course that is HESES. To stay informed about OFS announcements, including those relating to funding, you can sign up for our email alert service. Visit www.officeforstudents.org.uk/sign up for email alerts, and as usual, the last part of that URL is hyphenated. Thank you for listening and watching.